I'm now going to talk about Franklin D. Roosevelt as leader of the Democratic Party. At the outset of Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency, the Democrats had just undergone a prolonged period as a minority party. There were only two Democratic presidents between 1860 and 1932, Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson. The Republicans also dominated Congress for most of this period. Now, the Democrats were an unstable coalition of two groups. The epicenter of the party was in the South, and that dates back to the Civil War. Lincoln was a Republican, most Southerners were Democrats as a consequence, and their Democratic affiliation would survive for the next 80 years and wouldn't change, in fact, until the 1970s and 1980s. The second group was the smaller group and connected to urban ethnic bosses. The Republicans were the party of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and the immigrants who teamed into the cities in the early 20th century were organized by political machines in Chicago, New York, and other cities to vote Democratic, but they were really under the thumb of the urban machines that ran the Democratic Party in these cities. Now, Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency leads to a very significant change, one of the most important changes in American political history, because the New Deal that he promotes is responsible for creating a new Democratic Party. And the New Deal, because of the benefits it gives to ordinary Americans, brings new groups into the National Party. The first of these new groups, and most obviously, is organized labor. Second of these groups are welfare recipients, relief recipients, low-income people in general. The third are urban ethnics. These people are naturally democratic, but they largely voted in the past in local elections. Now they are mobilized by the New Deal to participate in a very large way in national elections and become a key constituency of the New Deal. The fourth group is women. Now, this is often overlooked, but women had largely voted Republican in the three presidential elections since they'd been given the vote in 1920. The New Deal, through provision of relief, through Social Security and other means, makes urban women into a Democratic constituency, and Eleanor Roosevelt's very prominent role, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt's very prominent role in the New Deal consolidates that bond. Women also become a key organizational force in the Democratic National Party. And the last group to move into the party are African Americans, who do not become truly democratic until the 1936 election, because they see the Republicans as the party of Lincoln. Now, in addition to all these new groups, we also have the White South, the traditional bastion of the party. And the party that Roosevelt has created is one which has a contradiction at its heart. It has a liberal, urban-oriented set of constituencies, these new groups that I mentioned, and a conservative-oriented old constituency. The new groups enable the Democrats to dominate the presidential election system because they are largely based in the big electoral college vote states like New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and they guarantee the Democrats a clear electoral college majority for the next 50 years. That doesn't really end until Ronald Reagan becomes president. Now, on the other hand, the conservative white Southerners are dominant in Congress. They have risen in the committee system. They are skilled parliamentarians. And from 1935 onwards, they become very suspicious that the New Deal is creating a big government that they can't control, and that the ultimate culmination of federal big government will be the imposition of racial equality in the South. The New Deal has done very little to promote racial equality, but it's a fear as the Southerners look to the future. Now, the problem is Roosevelt is too popular to attack openly until he commits his great mistake. He goes for the Supreme Court in 1937, and now the Southerners have their casus belli, their rationale to go for him and say, this man is dangerous, we must oppose him. Roosevelt, in turn, commits another great error. He decides that he is so personally popular within the party that he signals his intent to purge, and he uses that word, purge, his conservative opponents in the primary elections of 1938. Roosevelt has forgotten that he has very little control over the state parties, which are the power bases of these conservative Southerners. And the result of the attempted purge is almost total failure. The only Democrat that Roosevelt's allies managed to unseat actually represents a New York City congressional district. None of the Southerners are affected by Roosevelt's challenges to them, and in truth he does not devote sufficient time or energy to the campaign. The outcome is now that he has alienated the South, and they put a block on further support for the New Deal. The New Deal effectively comes to an end in 1938 because Roosevelt no longer has the votes to enact substantial reforms. But Roosevelt still has the National Party with him, and he decides to run for an unprecedented third term in office as a way of guaranteeing liberal control of the National Party. And in the 1940 election, he insists on having a liberal running mate at cost of removing his name from nomination if the National Convention does not support the nomination of Henry A. Wallace as his vice presidential running mate. Roosevelt wins re-election in 1940, obviously by less of a margin than the massive landslide of 1936. But the 1940 election is important because it consolidates the hold of liberalism over the National Party, courtesy of the urban support for the Democrats. It leaves a congressional wing of the party that is largely, if not but not totally, controlled by the Southerners. But you have this tension between the presidential wing of the party and the congressional wing of the party, and that will stymie reform for the next quarter century until the great logjam is broken by Lyndon Johnson's sweeping landslide re-election in 1964, which opens the way to the Great Society reforms of 1965-66.